Good morning, everybody. Morning. Everybody see me? Yay, great. Thanks for being here. My name is Phil Hartley. I'm president here at West Valley College, and this series is one of the things that we are the most proud of. This is the West Valley College Writers on Writing series. Books have always been my special friend, certainly, and I completely agree with Charles Eliot many years ago when he said that books are the quietest and most constant of friends. They are the most accessible and wisest of counselors and the most patient of teachers. And I still think that's as true today in the electronic age as it was 100 years ago when Charles Eliot wrote those words. The West Valley College Writing on Writers series is this year in honor of the Women's History Month. And so our writers this morning will be talking about women writers of early California. The WOW series, as we call it, the Writers on Writing series, is a dynamic and innovative series which provides an exciting opportunity for all the members of our college community to meet together and learn from leading authors. This series is sponsored by our Department of English at West Valley College and the college library and is supported by the associated student body as well. On behalf of our entire community, I would like to express my great respect and appreciation for the faculty and the staff that help organize and direct this really outstanding activity here at West Valley College, and to our great guest authors who have agreed to share their personal insights into their creative works. Books have been described as the paper memory of mankind, and today's panel of authors will certainly share an important part of our California memory for you today. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Doug Temkin, who will introduce our writers panel. Doug?
Great. I am Doug Temkin from the English Department, and before we start, I just want to thank the English Department and the library here for co-sponsoring these events. I also look for two other events coming up. There's a bookmaking workshop next Monday at 2 p.m. in the ILC room, no registration needed, and then there's a storytelling on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, factory fire, a historical event that involved a tragedy with women at the turn of the 20th century from the 19th, and that's March 22nd at 9:20 a.m. in this room. Right now, though, I'd just like to introduce Terry Beers, who's the head of the California Legacy Project, which he heads from Santa Clara University, where he's a professor of English as well, and Jessica Teeter, one of the readers and a producer and at KZU, the radio station at Santa Clara University. If you're more interested in readings and other historical broadcasts and podcasts, check californialegacy.org, where you can access a lot of the material that they produce. So I'd like at this point to introduce Terry Beers, who will tell you a little bit more about the readings today. Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming and attending this event with us this morning. California Legacy Project at Santa Clara University is a project that seeks to promote California literature and history. We republish books that have been out of print. We create new anthologies. We also do dramatic performances of California writing, and we produce these for KAZU, which is a public radio station affiliate. And we also produce these as podcasts. So if you're interested in some of the kinds of things that you hear today, you might want to check out our website, californialegacy.org, or go to iTunes, search for California Legacy, and you'll find our podcasts there. These are 90-second sort of dramatic readings, and some of them are actually quite funny, so have some fun doing that. What we're going to do today is we're going to look back at some of the writing by California women before the 20th century. These are pioneer women, women who came to California in the 19th century. They left letters, they left diaries, imaginative writing, all sorts of polemics. What we're going to do is we are going to sort of recreate some of those voices for you. Jessica is going to be reading these passages. I'll give you a little bit of introduction, but I want to acknowledge first that this particular script and the introductions were put together by my colleague Lita Kurth at Santa Clara University. I was hoping that Lita could be here today, but I don't see her in the audience. So the other thing I wanted to make sure that you knew is all of the women whose works that we will be representing today are listed in my bad handwriting on the board behind you. So if there's a voice, a work that you want to know more about, those are the writers that we're going to be talking about. And then if you've got any questions about the writers, about California writing in general after the performance, then by all means, let us hear from you. Okay? So let us begin. We often believe that in the past, women were simpler and more uniform creatures than they are now. But reading through the letters, books, and journals of women who have lived over a century ago, we find amazing diversity. Today, we will bring to life again the voices of women who traveled through or settled in California before the turn of the 20th century. Before there were luxury trains, crossing the desert from east to west was a long and deadly undertaking. Sarah Royce, a 49er whose son published her memoir in 1932, tells of the harrowing trip through Death Valley and over the mountains.
I found no difficulty this morning in keeping up with the team. They went so slowly, and I was so preternaturally stimulated by anxiety that before I was aware of it, I would be some rods ahead of them, straining my gaze as if expecting to see a land of promise. My imagination acted intensely. I seemed to see the Old Testament Hagar in the wilderness, walking wearily away from her fainting child among the dried-up bushes and seating herself in the hot sand. I seemed to become Hagar myself, and when my little one from the wagon behind me called out, "Mama, I want a drink," I stopped, gave her some, noted that there were but few swallows left, and then mechanically pressed onward again, alone, repeating over and over the words, "Let me not see the death of the child." Wearily passed the hottest noonday hour, with many an anxious look at the horned heads which seemed to me to bow lower and lower, while the poor tired hoofs almost refused to move. We hoped to see some signs of the river. I watched anxiously the heads of the two leading cattle. They were rather unusually fine animals, often showing considerable intelligence, and so faithful had they been through so many trying scenes, I could not help feeling a sort of attachment to them. And I pitied them as I observed how low their heads dropped, as they pressed their shoulders so resolutely and yet so wearily against the bows. "How far do you think it is now?" I said. "About 5 or 6 miles." At that moment, the white-faced leader raised his head, stretched forward his nose, and uttered a low moo. I was startled, fearing it was a sign for him to fall exhausted. "What is the matter with him?" "I think he smells the water," was the answer. "How can he at such a distance?" As I spoke, the other leader raised his head and uttered the same sound. The hinder cattle seemed to catch the idea, whatever it was. They all somewhat increased their pace, and from that time showed renewed animation. But we had yet many weary steps to take, and noon had passed before we stood in the shade of those longed-for trees beside the Carson River.
Louise Clapp, a Gold Rush pioneer who settled in Marysvale and later taught school in San Francisco, wrote under the name Dame Shirley. In a letter to his sister, she tells of an incident that stood out among the customary Sabbath day fights in 1852.
Following a volley of shouts and yells, there succeeded a death-like silence, broken in a minute after a deep groan, followed by the words, "Why, Tom, poor fellow, are you really wounded?" The man who called the doctor said that in the melee between the American and the foreigners, Domingo, a tall, majestic-looking Spaniard, had stabbed Tom Summers, a young Irishman, but a naturalized citizen of the United States. And at that very moment, said Domingo, with a Mexicana hanging on his arm and brandishing threateningly the long, bloody knife with which he had inflicted the wound upon his victim, was parading up and down the street unmolested. In the meanwhile, the consternation was terrific. The Spaniards, who, with the exception of 6 or 8, knew no more of the affair than I did, thought that the Americans had risen against them. And our own countrymen, equally ignorant, Fancy the same of the foreigners. The rich Barians, armed with rifles, pistols, clubs, dirks, etc., were rushing down the hill by the hundreds. Then arose the most fearful shouts of, "Down with the Spaniards! Drive every foreigner off the river!" Later, they began to act a little less like madmen than they had previously done. They elected a vigilance committee and authorized persons to go to the junction and arrest the suspected Spaniards. The first act of the committee was to try a Mexicana who had been foremost in the fray. She has always worn male attire, and on this occasion, armed with a pair of pistols, she fought like a very fury. She was sentenced to leave the bar by daylight, a perfectly just decision, for there is no doubt that she was a regular little demon. Some went so far as to say she ought to be hung, for she was the indirect cause of the fight. You see, it is always the old cowardly excuse of Adam in paradise. The woman tempted me, and I did eat.
Mary Bellew came to California in 1852 and made her living in a boarding house kitchen near Sacramento. Some of her letters to her sons in New Hampshire have been preserved.
3 times a day I set my table, which is about 30 feet in length, and do all the little fixins about it, such as filling pepper boxes and vinegar crutes, and mustard pots and butter cups. Sometimes I am feeding my chickens, and then again I am scaring the hogs out of my kitchen and driving mules out of the dining room. Sometimes I am cooking rabbits and birds here that are called quails, and I cook squirrels. On the 9th of September, there was a little fight took place in the store. I saw them strike each other through the window of the store. One went and got a pistol and started towards the other man. I never go into the store, but your mother's tender heart could not stand it. So I ran into the store and begged and pled with him not to kill him for 8 or 10 minutes. Then I ran through the dining room into my sleeping room and buried my face in my bed so as not to hear the sound of the pistol. That night at the supper table, he told the boarders if it had not been for what that lady said to him, Shields would have been a dead man. After he got his passion over, he said he was glad he did not kill him. So you see, your mother has saved one human being's life. You see that I am trying to relieve all the suffering and trying to do all the good that I can.
One of the leading lights of California in both literature and political action was Eliza Farnham, who worked, lectured, and wrote, despite significant setbacks and discouragement, for the benefit of women. She published California Indoors and Out in 1856.
There is very little valuable addition brought to the mental life by any trait of influence of California at this time. It is rare to meet with a man or woman who seems at all stirred by any but the money phase of the country. And it is almost literally true that there is no conversation except upon that subject, and among females upon the adventures of emigration. The different routes and their hardships and oppressive sense they suffer from lack of confidence and mutual respect in the communities that surround them. This feature of California life is very painful to large numbers of both sexes, but it is especially so to the sensitive and self-respecting of our own who reside in the towns and cities. I have been struck with it in the conversations I have had with good women in every walk of life here, except the favored few whose lots are cast in homes protected from the approach of suspicion and slander. There is an exquisite and touching story to be told someday of the unwearied devotion and faithfulness of another woman whose name I am not at liberty to use, though it ought to be held in honor by all true hearts, who, setting out an invalid from her home in Iowa, became, as her strong husband's will and energies failed under the tremendous sufferings of that terrible journey, the efficient caretaker of him and their 3 sons, yoked and unyoked the oxen, gathered fuel, cooked their food, and divided her scanty share when supplies were short, with those whose very veins she would have exhausted her own to fill had it been necessary or possible. She drove the teams, hunted wood and water in men's boots and tattered clothing, and for months performed all the coarser offices that properly belonged to the other sex, and reached her journey's end, a gentle, soft-spoken woman, with manners as unsoiled by her hard experience, as truly feminine and sweet, as if the refinements and ease of the drawing-room had surrounded her, instead of the dreary horrors and coarse tasks of those dreadful months. One must love such a woman.
Georgiana Bruce Kirby, a close friend of Eliza Farnham's and an early suffragist, educator, and public speaker, lived on a Santa Cruz ranch with her husband and family. From 1853 to 1860, she kept a journal.
In coming to Santa Cruz, it was my intention to teach school. There were many girls belonging to these Western families of sufficient promise to interest me in them. I could and desired to not only instruct them in books, but in their personal habits of cleanliness, neatness, order, courtesy, how to make and mend clothes, and so forth. But the pious young villain who was then keeping the mixed school, one of the cloth who frequently exhorted in the meetings, reigned supreme. The regular local minister, Mr. Brer, a self-conceited, brawling brute without a spark of tenderness, used all his influence against me in this, and added to the unpopularity of Mrs. Farnham, at whose house I was staying, rendered the entire plan abortive. This teacher afterward seduced some of the young girls and had to leave in the night, went on to the boards in San Francisco, and afterwards joined the filibustering expedition to the Sandwich Islands. After giving up the school, I took to gardening, much to the benefit of my health and improvement of my pocket.
Jessie Benton Fremont, perhaps the secret genius behind her explorer husband's success as an author, lived with him after the gold rush on their Mariposa Ranch property near Yosemite Valley.
There was one view Mr. Fremont wanted me to see, which we could only get on horseback, with a short climb at the peak of the mountain. From the summit, we could see 80 miles off the line of the San Joaquin River, defined by its broad belt of trees, running north and south parallel to our mountains. Connecting the two were many mountain rivers, crossing the broad plain and glittering like steel ribbons in the afternoon sun. The Merced, the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, and others. A turn of the head showed the peaks of the Yosemite 30 miles off, and the lines of blue mountains to the back of the everlasting snow of Carson's Peak, a stretch of 150 miles. It was a rough ride up, and rougher climbing after the horses could go no further and had to be left tied to trees with one man to watch them. Only one other was with us. Our party was only myself and my daughter, with her father and the two men. We were growing more and more enthusiastic as glimpses of this rare view came to us. Mr. Fremont told us the distances, which only singularly pure mountain air could have let the eye pierce. And the ear, too, I said. We must be 3 miles from the village, and yet how near sounds the barking of that dog. A dead silence fell on our animated people. They listened as the rough, low bark, broader and rougher even than that of a bulldog, rose again, sounding really close to us. I never question any acts of some few people, but was surprised and not too pleased to find myself hurried back down the steep, stony peak with only, "It is too late to finish the climb. We must hurry. Do not speak. Keep all your breath for walking." And hurry we did. I was fairly lifted along. Mr. Burke had disappeared and was now with Lee, bringing the horses to meet us, the horses' refractory. Without a word, I was lifted into the saddle. Mr. Fremont gathered up my reins himself and kept close to my side, and we fairly scurried down the mountain, I shamelessly holding on to the saddle as the steep grade made me dizzy. This dizziness so preoccupied me with the fear of fainting that I felt nothing else. We gained the stage road by the shortest cut, and then a loping gallop soon brought us home, where I was carefully lifted down, and all the consideration and care which they dared not give me on the hurried ride was now lavished upon me. I had been seriously ill not long before, and could not understand why I was so roughly hauled along. There was reason enough. It was no dog, but a grizzly that had made the warning bark, and we were very close to it. My ignorance spared me the shock of this knowledge, but the practiced mountain men knew it was not only a bear, but a she-bear with cubs. They knew she would not be likely to leave her cubs at that hour, when they were settling for the night, unless we came nearer or irritated her by talking and noises. Horses are terribly afraid of this powerful and dangerous animal, and one danger was that our horses would break away and run for safety, leaving us to the chances of getting off on foot. There I was the weak link in the chain. My daughter was fleet of foot and so steady of nerve that she was told the truth at once, and did her part bravely in keeping me unaware of any unusual condition. Fortunately, our riding horses were each pets and friends, and only required to be safe with their masters. Burke had got back instantly to help Lee, and once mounted, we were moved by one intelligence, one will. Very quickly, our bright drawing room filled with eager men, gun in hand. Armed men rode down the glen, intent on that bear, first coming to get all the information of the exact locality, then to ride and raise the countryside for a general turnout against it. For everyone had kept from the madam that a she-bear had been prowling around for some time, seeking what she could devour, and that she had devoured some and mangled more of Quigley's hogs, Quigley having a very fine and profitable hogs at his small ranch 3 miles from us.
Mary Chambers, one of the settlers connected to the famous gunfight at Muscle Slough, wrote a letter to the Visalia Weekly Delta in 1880 pleading on behalf of those farmers who had laboriously improved the land, but later were unable to pay the prices set by the railroads who owned them.
The first grain we put in, we had to go to Banta's station, a distance of 140 miles, for seed, taking 8 days to make the trip. Later, in bringing home the corn from another cellar, a nail in the bottom of the wagon tore a hole in the sack, and when lifted out of the wagon, 1/3 of the corn was gone. We took buckets and pans and tracked the corn back for 4 miles and picked it up. After planting and sowing, we were obliged to herd stock by day and night to keep off the wild cattle, which were starving and ready to devour anything green in sight. So we worked along for 3 years, many getting discouraged and leaving before this. Then the People's Ditch was started, but what an undertaking! 27 miles of irrigation ditch, and to be built by men without $1 and a living to make the while. Who was to do this? These very men who were termed by the company as squatters. Just suppose it had been the directors of the company that had been killed instead of the settlers. Flags would have been flying at half-mast, there would have been a wail from our state, and the Capitol would have been draped in mourning. Is there no justice for us poor settlers? Talk of poor oppressed Ireland and the miseries of the landlord system. Why, Ireland never had such landlords as these. I do hope that Providence will open a way for us out of this trouble and make these landlords feel the injustice that they have done to the people.
Many visitors and pioneers arrive from destinations even further than the East Coast. One writer, who went by the initials EMH, was an English woman who settled in Modoc County. In 1886, she published Ranch Life in California, based on her letters.
There is so much cooking to do for 6 of us, and the house always wants cleaning, and I'm very weary by the end of the day. I can quite understand how all the ladies here seem to have had all the fun washed out of them. The men get much more variety, as they often work for one another, and then they get a good gossip. A neighbor here had a baby lately, and when Mrs. K went to see her, 3 days after the child was born, she found her sitting up in bed kneading the dough. She had neither nurse nor doctor, only a neighbor with her at the time. After a week, she was up and doing all the work as usual, and she is a slight, delicate little woman, a Canadian. It is extraordinary how well people get over that sort of thing here. The worst part of the life is what I never for a moment calculated on, its loneliness. Of course, the boys coming back after working and joking together all day don't understand my being depressed and think I am discontented. I must get a nice companionable dog, like dear old Vixen. The dog here is very amusing. When it's a hot day, he goes and sits in the pig's drinking trough and lies there with only his head out of the water for hours. Today, George and Bob have been to Sulphur Bank and bought a cow. They drove her back the 5 miles, and the little calf as well. The cow's name is Becky, and she is very large, white in color, and very tame and affable in her manners. I have persuaded George to let me do the milking. He thought I had enough to do already, but we have made a compromise, and I am to give up washing up after supper. Becky, our new cow, is a great success. She is very easy to milk, and I like doing it very much. only that the calf is a little nuisance. It is supposed to have a third of the milk, but it will try to suck my hands when I'm milking, and I have to beat it away all the time. Did you know that calves are born with teeth? I did not. I had got up at 5:30 to milk my beloved cow, but then went to bed again. They all laugh at me because I think so much of my Becky, and say I think more of her comfort than I do of theirs. The calf is a little fiend. It bit my finger so hard that it bled, and I had to finish milking with one hand. I smack it hard now when it interferes. It curls its body around the cow's hind legs so as to be able to whisk its tail in my face. It does it on purpose, because it knows I have to leave off milking to shove it away, and then it gets a suck. I brought my little lamb back, and it is a dear creature, very tame, and follows me everywhere already. It won't drink its milk without sucking my finger, but it has such sharp little teeth I don't enjoy feeding it much. It was called Baby, but I have changed it to Bimby, after Ouida's story. Bimby has been sitting in my lap like a cat would, and now she's trying to eat some wood shavings. She's getting so fat and so fond of me that she won't leave me for a minute, and bleats in the most piteous way if she cannot find me. She lets me wash her, and is quite a companion to me.
In the winter of 1888-1889, Mary A. Wills traveled first class on a train from Pennsylvania to California. She stayed in the Golden State for a season, visiting the southern and central portions, and set down her recollections and judgments in A Winter in California.
The first day's journey is apt to be unsatisfactory. People are stiff, have not lost the home feeling, nor begun to fraternize. But as time rolls on, with one common destination, they rapidly become acquainted, visit each other, play various games, compare ideas, and have a real good jolly time. One morning when, several hours late, the want of breakfast was openly discussed, one lady, the proud possessor of a coffee pot, brewed a jorum of tea, and all sat with thankful hearts, applauded her skill, and drank to fill an aching void. There is generally much to interest an aggregation of people. This occasion was no exception. One party of Eastern people were conveying a wife and mother to San Diego, hoping in that mild yet bracing climate to win health to a frame wasted to the last extremity by consumption. I never saw such devoted attention as she had. They deadened her sensibilities with opiates, then exhilarated her with whiskey and champagne, and finally stimulated her with effervescing compounds. They were evidently not followers of the doctrine of Christian Science, the first and cardinal principle of which is to keep the mind from self, for they minister to it constantly. Paradoxical as it may seem, the husband was a Congregationalist minister, a fact I never would have suspected when I saw him play a skillful game of cards, smoke, and handle the corkscrew with an air of an expert. He was in demand as a storyteller, and told many good ones. Yet I failed to discover in them an exhortation or an epistle. He belonged to the school of muscular Christianity, and was interested in deer hunting, trout fishing, and camp life generally. I could not see that he lacked in the Christian graces. He only added others, and certainly the devotion he manifested to a sick and not very attractive partner would overbalance many shortcomings.
Kate Sanborn was a Smith College professor and writer who traveled in the West. In 1893, she published A Truthful Woman in Southern California.
The wildflowers are more fascinating to me than all those so profusely cultivated. I weary of 5,000 calla lilies in a church at Easter, and lose a little interest in roses when they bloom perennially and in such profusion that I have had enough given to me in one morning to fill a wash tub or a clothes basket. The wealth of color on the hills and mesas in springtime can never be described or painted. The state flower, the yellow poppy with the name that would floor any spelling match hero, the Eschscholzia, is most conspicuous and can be seen far away at sea. But there are dozens of others that it is better to admire and leave unplucked, as they wilt so soon. The ground is literally dolly-vardened with buttercups, violets, docathions, gilias, nemophilias, and the like. And yet, these are the mere skirmish line of the mighty invading hosts, whose uniforms surpass the kingly robes of Solomon, and whose banners of crimson and yellow and purple will soon wave on every hilltop in every valley. In April and May, the lover of nature may pass into the seventh heaven of botanical delight. Then, in favored sections, the display reaches a gorgeousness and a profusion that surpasses both description and imagination. No one can paint the grain fields as they look when the sun puts into every blade a tiny golden ray, and it is no longer everyday common grain, but an enchanted carpet of living, radiant golden green. We tourists call it grass, but there is no grass to be proud of in California. No one can paint the sky. No one would accept it as true to nature if caught on canvas. I will not attempt to describe the mountains with their many charms. I listened to a lecture lately where a man was struggling to do this, and it was positively painful. The flowery verbiage, the accumulated adjectives, the poetical quotations were overpowering. I seemed actually to be sinking into luscious mellifluousness. I shook it off my fingers as if it were maple syrup. Then, as he climbed higher and higher, on and up, never getting away from the richest verdure and the sweetest flowers, scenes for an artist to paint with rapture and a poet to sing in ecstasy, I found myself pushing up my forehead to improvise a mansard roof for my brain to swell in sympathy. And when he reached the summit and the panorama burst upon his enraptured vision, it was too much for my strained emotions, and I quietly slipped out. And the strangest part is that every word is true. And say what one will, one never gets near the reality. In this respect, you see, it differs from a floral catalog sent out in early spring or a hotel pamphlet with illustrations.
The last word goes to Mina Dean Halsey, an East Coast writer who satirized California travel writing in her 1909 book, A Tenderfoot in Southern California.
When I came out to California, Bill, some blamed idiot who knew it all advised me what to bring. He said, and I'll bet my old pair of suspenders he never saw California, says he, "Don't take any winter clothes out there with you. It's such a hot country, you won't need 'em." Well, I didn't, and by gum, I like to froze to death. All I had in that blamed trunk of mine was some peekaboo underwear and drop-stitch stockings. I wore a summer suit and a straw hat on the train to keep cool, and was snowbound on the way to Los Angeles. Frostbitten by gum after I got there. It was sure a cold night when we pulled in, and as the train was 4 or 5 hours late, I footed it up to town to a hotel. I didn't put up at Mr. Alexandria's or the Van Nuys, as I heard on the train they charged you extra to blow your nose if you stopped there. So I found a room on Main Street, which is nothing to be proud of. And the landlady hollered after me as I went up the stairs not to blow out the gas. I didn't. By gum, I was so stiff with cold, I kept it burning all night to melt the icicles I knew must be hanging to the end of my nose. There was only one measly pair of summer blankets on that bed, and the pillows were so small I came blame near to losing them in my ear before morning. I went to bed with all my clothes on, and the rest of the night I laid there and shook till I jarred the bed, and some feller who had a room under mine pounded on the ceiling and told me to make less noise up there. I couldn't help it. The slats on the old bed were loose and rattled anyway. If ever I was lonesome, Bill, and wanted to go home, I did that night. It wasn't because I was alone either, no, not that, for I'll bet I held up over 100 fleas in different sections of that bed on me before morning, and every one of them was big as a rat. Now, of course, I don't really mean to say that they were that big, but by gum, they looked so to me that night. You know, I never saw a real healthy, hustling California flea before. I could see their eyes shine as they looked at me, and I swear some of them had glasses on and carried lanterns so they could find me easier. There were old graybeards among them that had voted for years, and I bet hadn't a square meal since the last tenderfoot that slept in that bed.
And with that, thank you. So if anyone has any questions or comments.
You mentioned Spaniards and Mexicanos and Irish and Americans. And I think you said it was written in
I'm not sure what she means by Spaniard, because by Spaniard she could have also been conflating people from Mexico. One of the things that happened around the time of the gold rush, there was such an influx of Americans from the East into California at that time. And especially many of these people were suspicious of the Mexican land grant claims, that they began to talk about anyone who wasn't American as being a foreigner, even if they had been born in the state. So I think one of the things that could be happening in that particular passage is that she is picking up on that usage, that anyone who's not, American citizen born in the United States then becomes a foreigner. And of course, the funny thing about that, well, it's not funny, I mean, the tragic thing, I suppose, is that people who were immigrants from, say, Germany or England or other countries who were white were not necessarily deemed foreigners in the same way that people from, say, South America or Mexico could have been. So I think that's probably what could be going on.
Yeah, it's interesting because she does specifically call out the guy as being Irish, but then says, "Oh, but he's a naturalized, citizen."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know, is there an anthology with as many of these writers, maybe a Heyday Books?
Heyday Books has an anthology called No Rooms of Their Own that is a collection of, I think it's 11 women writers, mostly 19th century writers. Another good anthology is to look at the Anthology of California Literature that was put out by the University of California 4 or 5 years ago. You'll find some of these writers also in an anthology, also published by Heyday, called The Gold Rush, I think is the name of the title, and there are a lot of women's voices in there. And I might add another very good source, and I can't remember the web address offhand, but if you go to the Library of Congress, there is a website that they maintain there called California First Person Narratives. And in that website, they have, I am guessing, something like 150 different texts by all sorts of writers who came to California at different times. And a lot of these are women's voices that are just not available very easily anywhere else. So if you take a look at that website, you're going to find a lot of material that would be useful. And a good deal of some of this material came from that website originally. And you can also get our podcasts and listen to lots of women's voices. Nothing else? Yes.
That's not a question, but just a comment that I was kind of surprised by how friendly some of these pieces were. Things like this pioneering rugged life and how miserable the conditions were for so long for so many women, and to see humor in it. The one about the woman in Modoc County kind of milked the cow and so she got her face.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the toughest areas in the 19th century to live in California was Modoc County. Wasn't a lot up there, Yeah, I mean, there's a anonymous ballad, about the Modoc County cowboy, who's, I forget how it goes, but something that's like you were either drowned or fried, something along those lines. Mina Dean Halsey is a riot, and Kate Sanborn can be a riot, and yeah, I mean, there are lots of really funny voices that are there.
Humor really is the best way to deal with a bad situation anyway, right? So I think it's a good indication of, strength, that they're able to look at this situation that's really unpleasant and see the humor in it, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think another important aspect is to sort of remember, or at least try to appreciate how difficult conditions were in California, in the West, coming over long distances over land, and what you I think come away with in looking at a lot of the diaries is just how resilient the women were, often more resilient than the men, who sort of grouse and complain, and you just don't hear that in the letters and diaries in the women in the same way, which is also a sort of point that Patricia Limerick makes in a lot of her Western historicist revision.
Along those lines, I was wondering, whoever you said put the readings together.
Lita Kurth. I wish she were here so she could tell you that. I think what she did is she looked at a lot of material, and then from that, a couple of things. One is that she's trying to edit the material in a way, and this is sort of an interesting writing problem, so that you're taking segments that would reflect, with some care, the actual voice that you're using, and at the same time, realizing that you're taking an excerpt that has to be somehow appreciable by an audience, within a small area. So I think after a while, she probably abandoned the theme approach and was looking more at a sense of the different kinds of experiences that are recorded by pioneer women. And, there's just tons of material here that just is not touched in the time that we had.
I also thought it was really interesting, and the photograph one was my favorite one out of that one, how even though they're in this frontier situation for many of the segments that were read, very early years of American country settlement in California, and in some sense, like there are no rules for this, that you go to these far-flung areas and you're attempting to start economic enterprise from scratch. But even in the midst of this sort of Wild West frontier environment, the gender roles stay so constant. The woman in Mohawk County, like you immediately think, well, why not get together and cook with the other women? Why not pool the child care? And the role of family and the defined area for a woman, the sphere of domesticity was so sharply defined that she's making friends with the lamb.
Yeah.
That you just can't break out of that.
Yeah, the other one that I found really interesting along those lines is the Eliza Farnham piece about the woman who, during the travel from Iowa, her husband just couldn't deal and took over everything, and that to her, the greatest thing about that is that her feminine manner isn't disturbed by it. That she comes back and she's still, a soft-spoken, well-mannered lady at the end of it.
When Josiah Royce later wrote about his mother, that was always sort of his greatest admiration for his mother, was that she was always a lady. That Sarah Royce never became like that woman who was known to be around in men's attire all the time. So clearly she was a problem, right? In the Dave Shirley piece.
Yeah.
Dressed up as a man.
Well, and Sarah Royce's book, when it's published, is A Frontier Lady. Is the name of it. Farnham's a really interesting example for a number of different reasons. It's like she had been, before she came to California, she had been a matron at Sing Sing prison. And so she was on the forefront of trying to change things socially. When she came to California, one of her plans was to bring with her a number of women to help civilize the frontier here. So she had all of these different kinds of ideas about civilizing the frontier, and part of that was because of the lack of women in California and the West. And then she has another passage where she talks about the liberation she felt in wearing bloomers. Because then, it was almost like pants, and she could ride a horse, and she could do all of this work on a ranch that the other women who were still wearing these long skirts, would have more trouble doing. And we look at that and we think, oh, how quaint in some ways, but in other ways, I mean, this is pioneering stuff, and she's taking risk, and I think sometimes it's hard to appreciate just how deep those risks could be. Well, or not.
So with the republishing of the anthologies, are you guys more focused with women's literature or the history of California, or both?
Well, kind of all of that. We've had this publishing partnership between Santa Clara University and Heyday Books for about 5 years, and we've got, I think, 28 books in print, another 5 or 6 in the pipeline. Some of these are anthologies that might be theme-driven. So, for example, a few years ago, we published a book called Under the Fifth Sun, which is an anthology of Latino and Latina writing. We did an anthology of landscape writing. We have in the works an anthology of writing that all focuses on California animals. So the anthologies can be, quite diffuse. One of the things we try to do is to reprint significant works that are out of print. One of the first books we did was Bayard Taylor's El Dorado, which is a wonderful Gold Rush chronicle. And Bayard Taylor was a Herald Tribune reporter who was sent out to California to report on the Gold Rush by Horace Greeley. And this book was long out of print, and lo and behold, we brought it back, and 3 printings later, it's still growing strong, and you can get it at Costco. So we like to think that we're doing something of a service for, sort of raising awareness. And then with the radio anthology selections, which, play on KZU Public Radio, these are 90-second dramatic readings, just like nuggets of what you heard here. And then we occasionally, I get emails from people who hear about these things and want to know something else about a particular writer or historian or things like that. So it's, kind of just trying to build this grassroots awareness about California culture.
Sorry, embarrassed myself here. I think, like, in terms of what you're doing here with the presentation of women's writings is so cool because I'm a historian of California, and I've done a lot of research in Gold Rush era California in the journals and letters that were written by gold miners and male immigrants. And one thing, I was looking for something entirely different than how they represented themselves. But one thing I did notice, almost universally, was that the men had a strong tendency to completely misrepresent themselves because they're writing home or having these correspondences back home to their moms, their sisters, sometimes their wives, and you almost never get, you hear or you read that there was drinking, there was whoring, there was gambling, I mean, all kinds of just the various Wild West stuff going on, and the men never mention it in their letters, right? So you get this, oh, we went to church on Sunday, and no, you didn't, no, you didn't go to church on Sunday. The other men were engaged in gambling, but we, of course, stayed home and ate a sedate Sunday supper. No, you didn't, So it's really fun to get the female perspective on some of this Wild West atmosphere because it kind of adds a nice counterpoint to some of the, I think, misrepresentations that I've read in men's writing.
Yeah, well, they're not going to cop to the things that they're doing there. And of course, the people at home know, it's like, well, you never went to church when you were here. Why, why would that change? Yeah, and Dame Shirley especially gives a really interesting sort of portrait of what Gold Rush life was like. And in some respects, you get also a sense of the men who go counter to that particular stereotype, the men who, somehow kept some sense of civilization in themselves, were very courteous to children or to the women that they met because it was so rare, not just to see women in the Gold Rush camps, but to see children. I mean, this, and this would just, in some cases, just really appeal to, I think, people who remember their little sisters and little brothers, the children they left at home, and that kind of thing. There's a sort of tenderness that women can see in these men that they'd probably never express in their letters and diary entries.
It actually really reminds me, and I have no recollection now what it was, but I read a piece for the KZU recordings just a short while ago about exactly that, about a woman who was there with her daughter and was, noticed a young miner watching her, but didn't feel threatened by it. And then eventually, after some time had passed, he came up and asked if he could speak to her daughter because he had a sister that age that he was missing at home. So it does happen.
Yeah, and I wish I could remember
I
offhand
don't
because
remember
I
what it
can't.
was.
But
I'm
it's a
sorry.
funny passage because at first it seems really creepy. This guy's been kind of like watching
Watching
this child, and it's because he misses the family connection.
Johnson does an interesting treatment of that in Boring Camp, where she talks about how miners attempt to recreate a lot of, especially the gendered aspects of home life, right? Where you have men who would dress up as women and you could purchase a dance with one of these, these transvestites, at a miner's ball. So that is really, really useful.
Well, it's right there, maybe we'll end there.
Okay.
So, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.